My name is Ruby. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as steady, dependable, quiet, the one who listens more than she speaks. In professional settings, I've often been seen as supportive rather than strategic, useful, but not dangerous. The type who keeps things running smoothly while others take credit for the momentum. If you had asked my colleagues, or especially my boss, who I was back then, they might have said I was loyal, hardworking, easy to manage, someone who didn't challenge authority or demand the spotlight, and they would have been right, at least on the surface. I learned early that being underestimated can feel safer than being targeted. Silence, for me, wasn't weakness. It was survival. This story is not about revenge. It's not about winning an argument or humiliating someone who wronged me. It's about something quieter and far more unsettling. What happens when a person you've overlooked for years finally sees the full picture and stops protecting you from it? My boss thought I'd stay silent. He was wrong. But what unfolded wasn't loud or explosive. There were no shouting matches, no slammed doors, no triumphant speeches. What happened instead was slow, internal, almost invisible from the outside. One discovery turned me from a loyal employee into a threat, not because I changed who I was, but because I stopped misunderstanding my own position. For a long time, I believed that if I kept my head down and did good work, things would eventually balance out. That fairness was something you earned through patience. This story traces how that belief was tested, worn down, and finally replaced, not with anger, but with clarity. You'll hear about the small moments that didn't seem important at the time, the subtle dismissals everyone else laughed off, the role I was quietly assigned without being asked, and the moment I realized that silence, when chosen consciously, can be a form of power. I want to be clear about one thing from the beginning. I'm telling this story honestly, not to paint myself as a hero, and not to turn anyone else into a villain. People act within systems. They repeat patterns that benefit them. Sometimes they don't notice the consequences until those consequences arrive fully formed. What you're about to hear is a journey from invisibility to self-recognition, from compliance to agency, from being managed to becoming unmanageable without ever raising my voice. If you've ever felt quietly underestimated or found yourself shrinking to fit a role you didn't choose, you might recognize parts of yourself in this story. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently, honestly. Have you ever stayed silent, not because you had nothing to say, but because you thought it wasn't safe to be fully seen? At work, I was known as reliable, not brilliant, not visionary, not difficult, just reliable. If something needed to be done without fuss, it came to me. If a project was falling behind and someone needed to stay late without complaining, that was also me. I was the person managers trusted to handle it, which often meant absorbing complexity so others could appear decisive. No one said this out loud, of course. It lived in the tone of meetings, in who was interrupted and who wasn't, in which ideas were repeated by someone else and suddenly praised. I noticed these things, but I rarely reacted. I told myself observation was a form of professionalism. To my boss, I was dependable background noise, the kind of employee leaders say they couldn't function without, while never quite considering what would happen if that person stopped functioning for them. He once described me in a performance review as steady and low maintenance. He meant it as a compliment. I smiled and thanked him. Inside, something folded itself smaller. I didn't arrive at this role by accident. I had learned over the years and different workplaces that being visibly ambitious came with consequences, especially for women who didn't fit the expected personality. I wasn't loud. I wasn't charming in meetings. I didn't perform with confidence theatrically. My confidence lived somewhere quieter, more internal, and that made it easy to overlook. So I became useful instead. I became the one who remembered processes no one bothered to document, the one who knew which clients needed reassurance and which ones needed space, the one who smoothed over mistakes without escalating them. People trusted me with sensitive tasks, precisely because I never made them feel exposed. What I didn't realize then was that trust, when it's one directional, slowly becomes ownership. They owned my calm, my discretion, my willingness to carry weight without recognition, and I let them. I told myself it was temporary, that this was how careers worked, that you proved yourself quietly before you were invited into louder rooms. I believed patience was maturity. I believed silence was strategic, even when it wasn't chosen. It was simply expected. In meetings, my boss would speak about my work instead of letting me speak for it. Ruby handled the logistics, he'd say, as if logistics were something that happened automatically, as if my thinking didn't extend beyond execution. When others took credit, I didn't correct them. I told myself it didn't matter, that results spoke louder than words. But results, I learned, don't speak unless someone gives them a microphone. From the outside, I looked content. I didn't complain. I didn't challenge decisions publicly. I didn't ask for more visibility. That absence of friction made people comfortable. Comfort, I would later understand, is often mistaken for consent. What no one asked, what no one thought to ask, was how closely I was watching. Because invisibility has a strange side effect. You hear everything. You see patterns. You notice who panics when systems fail and who actually knows how to fix them. You see where power truly sits and where it only pretends to. At the time, though, I wasn't collecting leverage. I was just surviving within the shape I'd been given. Being useful felt safer than being seen. Predictable felt better than exposed. I didn't resent my boss. Not then. I believed he simply didn't know me well enough yet. I believed that if I stayed consistent, stayed loyal, stayed quiet, recognition would arrive on its own schedule. This part matters, so I want to be honest. I wasn't powerless. I was positioned, but I didn't yet understand the difference. And because I didn't understand it, neither did they. They thought I was exactly who I appeared to be: helpful, compliant, and permanently in place. They thought I would stay that way. The first moment that stayed with me didn't look important. That's what made it dangerous. It happened during a routine Monday meeting. the kind where nothing transformative is supposed to occur. We were reviewing a client rollout I had coordinated from start to finish. Timelines, risk mitigation, stakeholder communication. Every moving piece had passed through my hands. My boss stood at the front of the room, clicking through slides I had prepared. My name wasn't on any of them. That wasn't unusual. What was different was the way he summarized a decision I had made. We decided to simplify the delivery sequence, he said, using we in a way that erased me entirely. It reduced friction. That decision had been mine, not delegated, made. I had evaluated the risks, adjusted the schedule, and communicated the changes across 3 departments. He had signed off after the fact. I waited for him to acknowledge that, even briefly. A glance in my direction would have been enough. It didn't come. Instead, someone else asked a question. The meeting moved on. The room accepted the version of reality being presented because it was convenient, not because it was accurate. I felt something register in my body then, a small tightening, not anger, more like recognition, a note taken internally. After the meeting, a colleague leaned over and whispered, "Nice save on that timeline." She meant it kindly. I smiled and said thanks. Outwardly, nothing changed. But later that afternoon, I opened my notebook, the slim leather one I carried everywhere, and I wrote a single sentence. Pay attention to what gets rewritten. I didn't confront my boss. I didn't correct the narrative. I told myself it wasn't worth it, that these things happened, that leadership often spoke in shorthand. I even defended him to myself. He's under pressure. He didn't mean anything by it. That's how normalization begins. Not with cruelty, but with plausible deniability. Over the next few weeks, variations of that moment repeated themselves. My contributions were referenced vaguely. Decisions I owned were reframed as team consensus. When credit was distributed, it flowed upward and outward, rarely sideways, never back. Each instance was small enough to dismiss on its own, but together, they formed a pattern. What hurt wasn't the lack of praise. I didn't need applause. What unsettled me was the quiet assumption underneath it all that my work was detachable from me, that my thinking could be extracted without consequence. Once, during a client call, my boss interrupted me mid-sentence to rephrase what I was saying, not to clarify, just to repackage it in his voice. The client nodded, satisfied. The call ended successfully. My boss messaged me afterward. Good support on that. Support. I stared at the word longer than I needed to. I started noticing how often I was positioned as support, even when I was the source. How often I was framed as execution, never origin. It wasn't malicious. It was efficient, and that efficiency depended on my silence. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of me believed that pushing back would make me seem petty. Another part worried that if I spoke up, I'd be labeled difficult. I had seen what happened to people who challenged narratives too openly. They were slowly edged out of influence, branded as not a culture fit. So I made a different choice. I began remembering everything, not emotionally, strategically. I wrote dates, context, exact phrasing, not because I planned to use it, but because I needed to trust my own perception. Gaslighting doesn't always come from lies. Sometimes it comes from repetition. And repetition, unchecked, rewrites reality. I told myself I was overreacting. that I was being sensitive, that everyone experienced this at some point in their career. I reminded myself of the benefits of my position: stability, trust, and access. But that first small cut had already done its work. It didn't bleed, it didn't scar, it sharpened my awareness. Because once you notice the first quiet disrespect and realize everyone else is willing to ignore it, you understand something fundamental. Silence doesn't preserve fairness, it only preserves the system. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. That's how it works. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It waits for permission. And I gave it that permission. Not consciously, not proudly, but consistently. Once a pattern establishes itself, it begins to feel ordinary. What once made me pause now passes through me with less resistance. I told myself I was adapting, becoming resilient, professional. In truth, I was learning how to live inside diminishing space. Meetings became predictable. I'd prepare extensively, anticipate questions, and run scenarios in my head. During discussions, I would offer input when asked, never pushing, never insisting. My boss would summarize conclusions, often absorbing my ideas seamlessly into his own framing. No one objected. Why would they? The outcome worked. The client was satisfied. The team moved forward. Efficiency, again, disguised extraction. I noticed how my boss began assigning me work in a particular way, not as opportunities, but as obligations. "I'll have Ruby handle that," he'd say before I had agreed. The phrasing mattered. It positioned my time as pre-owned. When I stayed late to fix a reporting error caused by upstream, he thanked me privately. When success followed, he referenced strong team coordination publicly. I nodded along. I rationalized everything. He's under pressure. This isn't personal. I don't need recognition to feel secure. Each rationalization made it easier to swallow the next slight. What I didn't realize then was that I was training people how to treat me. Every time I accepted erasure without correction, I reinforced the narrative that my presence was optional, interchangeable. And still, I stayed, because leaving felt like failure. Speaking up felt risky, and staying silent felt familiar. There's comfort in familiarity, even when it costs you something. I had built an identity around being the calm one, the one who didn't make waves, the one who could be counted on to stabilize situations rather than complicate them. That identity came with praise. "You're so grounded," colleagues would say. "I don't know how you stay so composed." Composed. Another word that hid what was happening. I wasn't composed. I was contained. The more I accepted my assigned role, the more invisible its boundaries became. I stopped asking myself whether something was fair and started asking whether it was worth addressing. Most of the time, I decided it wasn't. Until one afternoon, when a newer colleague asked me a simple question. "Why don't you ever push back?" she said. Not accusatory, curious. I laughed it off, said something about choosing my battles. She nodded, but her eyes lingered on me in a way that felt unfamiliar, like she was seeing something I wasn't ready to see myself. That night, I thought about her question longer than I expected, not because it challenged me, but because it exposed how automatic my behavior had become. I wasn't choosing silence anymore. I was defaulting to it. And defaults are dangerous because they operate without consent. Still, I didn't change course. Not yet. Awareness doesn't always lead to action. Sometimes it just sits with you, waiting. I told myself I was being strategic, that patience would eventually pay off, that my boss would recognize my contributions when the timing was right. But timing, I would learn, rarely benefits the quiet. The workplace didn't ask for my silence explicitly, it rewarded it implicitly. And those rewards, access, stability, proximity to power, were just enough to keep me in place. What I didn't understand was that normalization is not neutral. It shapes expectations. It trains others to assume compliance. And once compliance is assumed, withdrawing it feels like betrayal. By the end of that year, I was deeply embedded in systems I didn't control, carrying responsibilities that weren't visible and protecting people who had stopped protecting me in return. I still believed I was being loyal. I still believed loyalty would be returned. I still believed silence was harmless. All of those beliefs were about to be tested, but not by confrontation, not by anger, not by a breaking point anyone else would recognize. The shift would come quietly, internally, and once it did, there would be no way to unsee what I had helped normalize. It took me longer than I like to admit to understand that I wasn't just being overlooked. I had been placed. Roles don't always come with titles. Sometimes they're handed out through repetition, through what you're asked to do, what you're never asked to decide, and how people speak about you when you're not in the room. Mine was clear once I allowed myself to see it. I was the reliable constant, the stabilizer, the one who made other people's leadership look effortless. I existed in the negative space of the organization, the parts that only became visible when they failed. When things worked, it was assumed. When something went wrong, it was quietly redirected to me. Ruby will sort it out. She's good at handling those details. Let's loop Ruby in so this doesn't escalate. None of these statements was false. That was the problem. I was good at those things. I had become good at them because I had been rewarded, subtly, repeatedly, for being the person who absorbed complexity without asking for authority. Over time, that skill set calcified into expectation. I wasn't seen as someone who could lead. I was seen as someone who enabled leadership. My value was measured by how little friction I created, not by the clarity I brought. And I had helped build that perception. Every time I solved a problem quietly instead of addressing its cause, I reinforced the idea that my role was maintenance, not direction. Every time I softened my language to avoid discomfort, I made it easier for others to overlook the weight I carried. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments. A project I had designed was assigned to someone else to own, while I was asked to support them. A strategic meeting happened without me, even though the outcome directly affected systems I managed. A junior colleague came to me for guidance, then presented that guidance as her own in front of leadership, with no malice, just mimicry. That one stung more than the rest, because it showed me how roles replicate themselves, how invisibility teaches others to disappear you without even meaning to. I remember sitting at my desk after that meeting, staring at my screen without reading a word. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If I stay exactly as I am, is this what my future looks like? The answer came faster than I expected. Yes, not because anyone was cruel, not because my boss was a villain, but because systems don't change unless someone disrupts them, and I had been maintaining this one flawlessly. There was a strange grief in that realization. I had invested so much energy into being dependable that I hadn't noticed how small my field of influence had become. Dependable people are rarely asked what they want. They are asked what they can handle, and I could handle a lot. That was my leverage, though I didn't yet recognize it as such. The role I had been assigned came with unspoken rules. Don't surprise people. Don't demand credit. Don't shift the balance. Be essential, but never central. Once I saw those rules, I couldn't unsee them. I noticed how my boss spoke to me differently from how he spoke to others, with less explanation, more assumptions, as if my agreement was a given, as if my time belonged to the role, not to me. He trusted me completely, and trusted that I would never use that trust in a way that disrupted him. That trust was the cage. I didn't feel angry. I felt awake. Awareness didn't make me confront anyone. It didn't make me change my behavior outwardly. Not yet. But internally, something reorganized itself. I stopped asking how to do my job better. I started asking why my job was shaped the way it was. And once that question exists, silence begins to feel different. Less like protection, more like a choice. I still showed up. I still delivered. I still played the role flawlessly, but I was no longer confused about what that role was or what it had cost me. And that clarity was the beginning of something irreversible. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. It didn't come from a raised voice or a final straw anyone else could point to later and say, that was the moment. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a way so quiet that even I almost missed it. I was reviewing a routine report, one of the many documents that passed through my hands before being forwarded up the chain. It was administrative on the surface, the kind of thing no one paid attention to unless something went wrong. As I cross-checked numbers, something didn't align. A discrepancy, small enough to ignore, large enough to matter if questioned. I traced it back through emails, shared drives, and approval threads. What I found wasn't scandalous, it wasn't dramatic, but it was revealing. A decision had been documented in a way that protected leadership from accountability while shifting potential liability downward. Not maliciously, at least not explicitly. It was framed as procedural, routine, standard practice, except it wasn't standard. It relied on my silence. The realization didn't shock me. It settled into place with a strange sense of calm. This wasn't an accident. It was a pattern I had unknowingly been part of. I could correct it easily, send a clarification, adjust the wording, flag it quietly, like I always did. I hovered over my keyboard and didn't type. For the first time, I asked myself a different question. Not what's the right thing to do, but who does this protect? The answer was immediate. Not me. That was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly, internally. I saw the system clearly, not as a series of tasks, but as a web of incentives. I saw how my reliability had been quietly integrated into risk management, how my discretion wasn't just appreciated, it was depended on. I wasn't just a loyal employee, I was a buffer. The weight of that understanding didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I fixed the report, but I saved a copy of the original. Dated, time-stamped, context preserved. Then I did something new. I documented the decision path, not emotionally, not defensively, methodically. Over the next few days, I noticed similar structures everywhere. Emails that assumed my agreement without asking. Processes that placed responsibility on me without authority. Language that insulated others while exposing me. None of this had felt personal before. Now it felt structural, and structures can be understood. That understanding changed how I moved, not visibly. I didn't become colder or more distant. If anything, I became calmer, more deliberate. Silence, I realized, wasn't just something I endured. It was something I could use. The day something shifted wasn't about discovering wrongdoing. It was about discovering leverage. Not leverage in the dramatic sense. Not blackmail or threats. Leverage in the quiet sense. Knowing where you stand in a system and how much it relies on you not knowing. I didn't confront my boss. I didn't alert anyone. I continued exactly as before, except now. Every action passed through a different filter. Does this expose me? Does this protect me? Who benefits from my discretion? These questions didn't make me cynical. They made me accurate. I began to understand that loyalty without boundaries is not a virtue. It's vulnerability. And vulnerability, when consistently exploited, even unintentionally, becomes liability. The shift was subtle, but it was permanent. Once you see yourself clearly within a system, you can't go back to believing the system will see you for you. That afternoon ended like any other. I shut down my computer. I packed my bag. I walked out of the office without incident. No one noticed anything different. That was the point, because the most important changes don't announce themselves. They reorganize you from the inside. And once that reorganization begins, silence stops being passive. It becomes intentional. After the shift, nothing about my behavior changed on the surface. That was intentional. I still arrived early, still responded quickly, still handled problems before they escalated. To anyone watching, I was the same Ruby, steady, capable, unthreatening. But internally, silence had changed its meaning. Before, I stayed quiet because it felt safer, because speaking up came with a social cost, because I believed restraint was maturity. Now silence was a decision. And decisions come with awareness. I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill, not by refusing, but by waiting. If someone failed to provide context, I asked for it instead of compensating. If an email implied agreement, I responded with clarification rather than compliance. These were small adjustments, almost invisible, but they changed the flow of responsibility. People began to notice delays where there had once been seamless coverage. Not dramatic delays, just enough to require attention. Questions that had once been absorbed by me now surfaced where they belonged. No one accused me of anything. There was nothing to accuse. I was still doing my job, just not everyone else's. Silence, when chosen, has edges. I became more precise in meetings. I spoke less, but when I did, I anchored my statements clearly. In my assessment, based on the data I reviewed, language that attaches thinking to a thinker, my boss didn't push back. He didn't need to. He still assumed my loyalty, still assumed my discretion. What he didn't realize was that discretion no longer meant self-erasure. I noticed how often others mistook calm for compliance, how they interpreted my lack of reaction as agreement. That misunderstanding became useful. When you're no longer trying to be seen, you're free to observe without interference. I watched how decisions were made, who panicked under pressure, who relied on me more than they admitted. I saw how often my boss deferred complexity downward, trusting that I would resolve it quietly. And I let him, not because I wanted to protect him, but because I wanted to understand the system fully before stepping outside it. Silence buys time, and time used well buys options. I began organizing my documentation more carefully, not just saving files, but mapping dependencies. Who approved what? Where knowledge lived? What would break if I stopped intervening? This wasn't sabotage. It was awareness. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was simply making myself legible to myself. The strange thing was how empowering this felt without being aggressive. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I was aligning my actions with my self-respect. There's a particular calm that comes from no longer explaining yourself to people who aren't listening anyway. My boss continued to assume I would always be there to absorb pressure. That assumption was the last thing to change and the most consequential. Because when silence becomes a choice, you also choose when to stop using it. And that choice belongs to you. I still hadn't decided what I would do. Leave, speak up, escalate. Those options existed, but they didn't feel urgent. What felt urgent was clarity, and clarity requires stillness. So I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I was preparing. What they never noticed wasn't my intelligence. It wasn't my competence either. Those things were acknowledged selectively, superficially, when convenient. What they never noticed was how much of the organization ran through me without being visible as me. Once silence became intentional, I started seeing the structure beneath the routine, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the slow, patient way of someone who finally stops rushing to fix things and instead watches how they fail. I began tracing threads, not because I wanted power, but because I needed to understand where it already existed. I knew which processes were documented and which ones lived only in people's heads. I knew which clients relied on institutional memory rather than written agreements. I knew which decisions had been approved casually in emails that no one revisited once things worked. Most importantly, I knew where my name wasn't, even when my influence was. That absence had always bothered me emotionally. Now, it interests me strategically. I didn't hoard information. I organized it. I built quite a few redundancies, not to undermine anyone, but to protect myself. I noted timelines, saved versions, cross-referenced approvals. I learned how policies were interpreted in practice, not just how they were written. All of this happened during normal work hours, embedded seamlessly into my existing role. No secrecy, no deception, just attentiveness. Because when you stop overperforming emotionally, you free up cognitive space. I also paid attention to how often my boss relied on me without realizing it. He delegated complex situations to me with phrases like, "Can you just handle this?" or "You know how this works." Those phrases felt flattering once. Now they sounded like admissions. I never corrected him. Instead, I asked questions that clarified responsibility. I documented outcomes that attached decisions to names, gently, professionally, without accusation. If he approved something verbally, I followed up in writing. If he implied direction, I summarized it neutrally. This wasn't defensive. It was accurate. Accuracy, I learned, is unsettling to people who benefit from ambiguity. Still, no one noticed. Why would they? I wasn't changing results. Clients were happy. Projects moved forward. The surface remained smooth. What changed was my internal map. I began to see how easily the narrative of competence could be shifted simply by changing who spoke when. How fragile certain reputations were once stripped of borrowed labor. I also noticed something else, something quieter. No one checked in with me anymore. Not about workload, not about goals, not about growth. They assumed I was fine. Being seen as fine is a dangerous place to live. It makes you invisible until you're gone. That invisibility was my camouflage. I didn't exploit it. I didn't weaponize it. I studied it because the truth was, if I disappeared tomorrow, the disruption wouldn't be immediate. It would be delayed, subtle, confusing. Things would unravel slowly, and that slowness mattered. I wasn't looking to cause harm, but I needed to understand what I was actually worth beyond the stories people told about me. So I stopped measuring my value by praise or proximity to leadership. I measured it by dependency. Who came to me when things got complicated? Who deferred to my judgment privately but not publicly? Who benefited most from my silence? The answers were consistent. And once you see consistency, you see leverage. Not the kind you announce, the kind you carry quietly. They never noticed the shift because it didn't threaten them yet. People don't notice preparation when it looks like professionalism. They don't question documentation when it looks like diligence. They don't fear calm when they mistake it for contentment. I didn't feel powerful. I felt prepared. And preparation doesn't make noise. It waits. The reveal didn't come from a dramatic discovery. There was no hidden folder, no explosive email, no single document that changed everything in one stroke. What I uncovered was quieter than that and far more destabilizing. It began when I was asked to prepare background materials for a routine external audit. Nothing unusual. I had supported audits before. I knew the rhythms, the language, the expectations. This one was framed as low risk, almost procedural. Just pull what they need, my boss said. You know the drill. I did know the drill. That was the problem. As I gathered files, I noticed how often my work functioned as connective tissue between departments. How decisions made in one area were justified by documentation in another. Documentation I had often created or refined after the fact to reflect what leadership meant, not necessarily what had been said. Again, this wasn't illegal. It wasn't corrupt. It was convenient. And convenience has a habit of blurring responsibility. As I reviewed approval chains, something crystallized. I wasn't just a coordinator. I was the interpretive layer, the person who translated vague directives into defensible records, which meant that my understanding of intent carried weight, more weight than anyone realized. That realization landed without excitement, no adrenaline, just clarity. If questions arose, people would turn to me, not because I held authority, but because I held coherence. I knew how things fit together. I knew why certain choices had been made, even when those reasons were never formally stated. And crucially, I knew when they weren't. The private reveal wasn't about wrongdoing. It was about asymmetry. I carried more institutional risk than my title reflected. I carried more knowledge than my visibility suggested, and I carried it alone. That solitude mattered because it meant I had been absorbing exposure without protection. I closed my laptop that evening and sat still for a long time, not anxious, not angry, just focused. This wasn't something to confront emotionally. It required distance. Over the next week, I reviewed my own records, emails, notes, calendars, the leather notebook I'd kept for years without fully understanding why. Patterns emerged, not malicious ones, structural ones. Leadership relied on my discretion to maintain continuity. My silent, smooth transitions softened inconsistencies and preserved narratives. If I spoke less carefully, if I stopped translating, ambiguity would surface, not immediately, but inevitably. The private reveal was this: I wasn't powerful because I couldn't expose anyone. I was powerful because I could step back, because systems that rely on unacknowledged labor don't collapse with confrontation. They destabilize with absence. And absence doesn't look like an attack. It looks like neutrality. That understanding brought an unexpected feeling, not triumph, but grief. I had been loyal to a system that didn't know how to protect me because it didn't know how much it relied on me. I hadn't been invisible because I lacked value. I had been invisible because my value was easiest to extract when it wasn't named. I didn't tell anyone what I had realized, not my boss, not colleagues, not friends. This wasn't a secret to share. It was a truth to sit with. Because once you understand your real position, you have to decide what kind of person you want to be next. Someone who continues to buffer others at their own expense, or someone who chooses alignment over accommodation. The reveal didn't give me answers. It gave me options. And options change everything. I didn't act immediately. I waited. Because the most dangerous thing you can do after gaining clarity is move too quickly before you understand the cost of each path. The private reveal wasn't an ending, it was a threshold. And once crossed, there was no returning to ignorance. Clarity doesn't force action. That was the hardest part to accept. After the private reveal, I didn't feel an urgent need to do anything. There was no ticking clock, no external pressure, just a widening internal awareness, and with it, the weight of choice. For the first time, staying felt as deliberate as leaving. I listed my options, not on paper, but quietly in my mind. I could continue as I was, maintain the role, keep translating ambiguity into order, protect others from the consequences of their own vagueness. This path was safe, familiar. It required no explanation, but I knew what it cost. I could speak up, ask for recognition, clarify boundaries, request a role that reflected my actual responsibility. This path sounded reasonable, professional. But I also knew how organizations respond to sudden clarity from people they've grown comfortable overlooking. Clarity, when unexpected, is often perceived as a threat. I could leave quietly, find another role elsewhere, take my knowledge and experience, and start fresh. This option felt tempting, but incomplete. Leaving without addressing the imbalance felt like abandoning myself. And then there was the option I hadn't considered until recently. I could stop absorbing risk that wasn't mine, not as a protest, not as punishment, as alignment. That option didn't require confrontation. It didn't require approval. It required consistency. It was irreversible. not because it would cause harm, but because it would reveal reality. Once I stopped buffering the system, it would have to adapt or expose itself. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about loyalty, about fairness, about the version of myself I had been protecting all these years by staying quiet. I realized something uncomfortable. I had been loyal to an image of stability that didn't include me. My boss wasn't malicious. He was operating within incentives. So was I. The difference was that I was the only one expected to sacrifice clarity for cohesion. The decision point wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with certainty. It came with acceptance. Whatever I chose, I would lose something. But only one choice allowed me to stop losing myself. I decided I would no longer translate, no longer reinterpret vague directives into safe documentation, no longer preemptively smooth over misalignment before it reaches those responsible. I would do my job accurately, fully, nothing more, nothing less. This wasn't a resignation. It wasn't a rebellion. It was integrity. I didn't announce the decision. I didn't warn anyone. There was nothing to announce. I simply adjusted how I worked. The cost of that adjustment wouldn't show up immediately. It never does. Systems don't react to truth all at once. They resist it quietly until they can't. I knew what would happen eventually. Confusion, delays, questions, not because I would create them, but because I would stop preventing them. That knowledge brought a calm I hadn't felt in years, because for the first time, my actions matched my awareness. The decision point wasn't about becoming a threat. It was about refusing to remain invisible. And once that refusal is made, not loudly, not defiantly, but internally, there's no going back. You don't need to raise your voice when your presence finally carries weight. You just need to stop disappearing. The first thing people misunderstand about moving in silence is that it looks like inactivity. It doesn't. It looks like a restraint. After the decision point, I didn't accelerate. I slowed down, not in output, but in intervention. I stopped anticipating problems before they were visible. I stopped correcting phrasing that wasn't mine. I stopped absorbing ambiguity on behalf of others. I did my work precisely as assigned, no interpretation, no cushioning. That precision changed everything. Emails that once would have passed quietly now prompted follow-up questions. Approvals that had relied on assumptions required clarification. Processes that had functioned smoothly because I bridged gaps began to show seams. No one accused me of underperforming. There was nothing to point to. In fact, my work became more defensible than ever. I documented decisions thoroughly. I confirmed instructions in writing. I referenced policy when appropriate. Not aggressively, just accurately. This wasn't legal maneuvering, it was professional alignment. Still, it unsettled people. My boss began checking in more often, not about workload, but about status. Just wanted to make sure we're aligned, he'd say. We were aligned on the truth. What he felt, but didn't yet understand, was the loss of frictionless coverage. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means letting reality surface on its own. I also began quietly preparing for independence, updating my resume, reaching out to old contacts, not asking for favors, just reconnecting. Understanding the market value of my skill set outside this system. That preparation wasn't an exit plan. It was grounding. When you know you can leave, staying becomes a choice, not a trap. I reviewed company policies carefully, not to find loopholes, but to understand boundaries, where responsibility ended, where authority began. where discretion was assumed rather than required. That knowledge gave me confidence without arrogance. The strangest part was how calm I felt. There was no adrenaline, no fear, just alignment. Weeks passed. Then small things began to happen. A decision stalled because no one wanted to sign off without my interpretive support. A client asked a question that exposed an internal inconsistency. A meeting ended without resolution because assumptions collided. Each time I stayed calm, I provided facts. I referenced records. I declined to speculate. People weren't upset with me. They were confused by the absence of my usual smoothing. Confusion is uncomfortable, but it's also informative. It forces people to look at systems they've taken for granted. My boss began taking more visible ownership, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. The work didn't change. The accountability did. Still no confrontation. That's the thing about moving in silence. It denies people a villain. There was no dramatic shift to resist, no attitude to correct, no behavior to discipline. Just a professional who had become unavoidably accurate. Accuracy has weight, and weight shifts balance. I knew the consequences would come eventually. Systems don't like exposure. They prefer buffers. But I was no longer willing to be one. Moving in silence wasn't about control. It was about coherence. And coherence, once established, carries forward on its own momentum. The consequences didn't arrive with noise. They arrived with discomfort. At first, it showed up as hesitation. People second-guessed themselves more often. Questions that used to be routed quietly to me now surfaced in meetings. Decisions slowed, not because anyone was obstructing them, but because no one was cushioning them anymore. The system felt heavier. My boss noticed before anyone else. Not consciously, not all at once, but in the way people sense a loss of balance before they can name it. He began looping me into conversations later than usual, as if something essential was missing, and he was trying to locate it after the fact. "Can you take a look at this?" he asked one afternoon, forwarding an email chain already a week old. I looked. I responded. I pointed out what the records showed, what had been approved, what hadn't. I didn't fix it. That distinction mattered. The response was factual, neutral, complete, and insufficient to restore ease. He thanked me, always polite, always professional, but something in his tone shifted. Not irritation exactly, more like uncertainty. For the first time, he didn't know whether things were under control. That uncertainty spread quietly. A client escalated a minor issue, not because it was severe, but because no one had resolved it cleanly the first time. Another department flagged a process gap I had been compensating for without realizing it. These weren't crises, they were signals, the kind organizations often ignore, until they accumulate. People began asking me more direct questions, not because they wanted my opinion, but because they wanted reassurance. I gave them clarity, not comfort. Clarity is honest. Comfort is optional. Meetings grew longer. Follow-ups multiplied. Documentation increased. The workload didn't increase. The friction did. I watched as my boss began working later, taking more calls, double-checking details he'd once delegated instinctively. He wasn't angry. He was confused. Because from his perspective, nothing had changed. From mine, everything had aligned. That's the quiet power of withdrawing unspoken labor. You don't remove anything visible. You simply stop compensating. And when compensation ends, Dependency reveals itself. No one blamed me. There was nothing to blame. My performance reviews remained strong. My output remained consistent. But the ease I once provided, the invisibility that made everything feel seamless, was gone. And with it, the illusion that leadership alone had been holding things together. People began to feel the loss before they understood the cause. That's how consequences begin, not with punishment, with absence. I stayed calm through it all, not detached, present. I answered questions when asked. I shared information when appropriate. I declined to speculate or preempt. There was a quiet dignity in that restraint. I wasn't proving a point. I was letting reality speak in its own time. And reality, unlike people, doesn't rush. By the time panic appeared, it didn't announce itself as panic. It arrived as urgency, dressed up as concern. My boss started scheduling more frequent check-ins, not formal meetings, casual ones. Just to sink, he'd say. The tone was lighter than the intent. He asked questions he'd never asked before, about timelines, about dependencies, about things he used to assume were simply handled. He was trying to reinsert himself into a system that no longer bent quietly around him. I answered everything honestly. That honesty was the problem, because honest answers don't always offer solutions, especially when the solution used to be someone's invisible labor. He began saying things like, maybe we should revisit how responsibilities are divided, or we might need to tighten some processes. These were reasonable observations, late ones. What he didn't say, but what hovered between us, was, why does this suddenly feel harder? From his perspective, I had changed. From mine, I had stopped compensating. The difference mattered. There was a moment, small but telling, when he tried to recreate the old dynamic. He casually mentioned that a situation would probably be easiest if you just handled it like before. Before. The word landed softly and carried weight. I paused before responding. Not to dramatize it, but because I wanted to be accurate. I'm happy to support, I said evenly, but I'll need clarity on who's owning the decision. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was startled. He nodded slowly. Right, of course. But the ease didn't return. That was when I knew it was too late to fix it. Not because the relationship was broken, but because the illusion was. He could have acknowledged my role earlier, could have redistributed authority when it still felt natural, could have asked what I needed before the system began straining under its own weight. Now, any attempt to course correct would require admitting how much had been taken for granted, and systems rarely volunteer that kind of humility. I noticed others feeling it too. Colleagues became more cautious, less certain. They sensed that something fundamental had shifted, even if they couldn't articulate what. People don't panic when things break. They panic when things stop working quietly. My boss began documenting more aggressively, looping in legal, asking for sign-offs that once lived in trust. The organization was responding not to me, but to exposure. And exposure doesn't negotiate. There was a meeting, one of the last before everything fully reconfigured, where leadership discussed a recent failure to meet expectations, not a disaster, a missed opportunity. As they spoke, I realized something with almost clinical clarity. They weren't trying to fix the problem, they were trying to restore the buffer. But buffers don't return once they become conscious of their role. You can't ask someone to unknow what they know. You can't ask them to disappear again without paying a price. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was resolved because the truth was simple. The system had functioned by externalizing cost onto my silence. Once that silence withdrew its protection, the cost returned to where it belonged. It was too late to fix it quietly. Anything that happened next would be visible. And visibility changes everything. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. It was scheduled as a one-on-one. No subject line beyond check-in. No HR. No raised voices waiting behind closed doors. Just a room, a table, and the truth catching up to both of us at the same time. My boss arrived with the notebook. That alone told me something had shifted. He was prepared, not defensive, but careful. People get careful when they realize control has thinned. He didn't start with accusations. He didn't need to. I feel like something's changed, he said, leaning back slightly. I can't quite put my finger on it. I nodded, not in agreement. In acknowledgement, he went on, listing observations. Processes are taking longer. Decisions need more clarification. His own workload was increasing in places he hadn't expected. As he spoke, I realized this was the first time he was experiencing the system without my translation. I waited until he finished. Then I spoke, not to justify myself, not to indict him, but to describe reality. I've been doing my role as defined, I said, accurately, fully, but I've stopped making assumptions on behalf of others. He looked at me, searching my face for something, emotion maybe. There was none to find. So you're saying, he began. I'm saying clarity has replaced interpretation. I finished. That's the difference. The room went quiet. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even embarrassed. He was processing. I didn't realize how much I relied on you for that, he admitted finally. That sentence mattered, not because it apologized, but because it named the truth. I know, I said gently. That's why it worked for so long. We didn't talk about fairness. We didn't talk about credit. We didn't talk about the past in emotional terms. We talked about structure, about roles that had grown without definition, about responsibilities that had expanded without authority, about how silence had filled gaps no one had been accountable for. It was the calmest, difficult conversation I'd ever had. At one point, he asked, "What do you want?" The question hung there, simple, heavy. I want alignment, I said, between responsibility and authority, between expectations and acknowledgement. He nodded slowly, not promising anything, not resisting, just understanding. That was enough, because confrontation without heat doesn't seek victory. It seeks clarity. There was no dramatic resolution, no immediate reorganization, no sudden praise. But there was a line drawn, and lines once drawn change how people move. When the meeting ended, I didn't feel relieved. I felt complete. I had said what needed to be said in the way it needed to be said, without anger, without apology, without shrinking. And whatever happened next, whether the system adapted or I moved on, I knew something essential had shifted permanently. I was no longer invisible, and I didn't need to be loud to make that true. I didn't walk out of that meeting transformed overnight. There was no cinematic moment where everything suddenly made sense and aligned perfectly. Change didn't arrive as a triumph. It arrived as steadiness. What shifted was not my job title, not immediately, not my workload, not even my environment. What shifted was my relationship to myself. For the first time in my career, I stopped measuring my worth by how smoothly things ran around me. I stopped equating usefulness with value. I stopped confusing endurance with integrity. I still worked hard. I still cared. But I no longer disappeared inside that care. People responded differently once I stopped softening my presence. Not dramatically, subtly. They listened more closely. They asked clearer questions. They paused before assuming. Some of that was respect. Some of it was caution. Both were fine. My boss began involving me earlier in decisions, not because he suddenly became enlightened, but because the cost of not doing so had become visible. Authority and responsibility began to move closer together. Not perfectly, but closer. I no longer rushed to fill silences in meetings. I let questions hang until someone owned them. I spoke when I had something to add, not to prove relevance, but to assert reality. What surprised me most was how little resentment I carried. I had expected anger to surface once I stopped suppressing myself. It didn't. Clarity had replaced it. I understood now that my boss hadn't been stealing from me consciously. He had been responding to incentives I helped create by being endlessly accommodating. That didn't excuse the imbalance, but it explained it. An understanding dissolved bitterness. Who I am now is not someone hardened by the experience. I'm someone integrated by it. I know my patterns. I know my instincts. To smooth, to stabilize, to absorb. Those instincts aren't flaws. They're strengths when chosen freely. The difference is that I choose now. I choose when to support and when to step back, when to speak, and when silence serves me, not others. When to be generous and when to be precise. I no longer believe that being underestimated is safer than being seen. It's just quieter. And quiet, when unchosen, erodes you. I didn't become dominant in the way people usually imagine dominance. I didn't assert control through force or charisma. I became dominant through coherence, through alignment, through refusing to fracture myself to keep systems comfortable. If I leave this role someday, and I might, it won't be because I was pushed out or overlooked. It will be because I chose what fits the person I've become. And if I stay, it will be as someone fully present in her own work, not as a shadow behind others' authority. Who I am now is someone who understands that silence is not a virtue by default. It's a tool. And like any tool, it should belong to the person using it, not to the system that benefits from it most. This story doesn't end with a downfall. No one was fired. No speeches were made. No apologies were demanded or extracted. What ended was something quieter and far more important. An illusion. For a long time, I believed that staying silent was a form of strength, that endurance was maturity, that loyalty meant absorbing discomfort without naming it. I was wrong. Silence is not moral by default. It only becomes moral when it is chosen, when it aligns with self-respect rather than fear. The moment I stopped disappearing, the system around me had to adjust. Not because I attacked it, but because I withdrew something it had grown dependent on, my unacknowledged labor. That withdrawal wasn't cruel. It wasn't vindictive. It was honest. And honesty changes power dynamics more reliably than confrontation ever could. If there's a lesson here, it's not that you should outsmart your boss or quietly undermine institutions. That kind of thinking replaces one imbalance with another. The lesson is simpler and harder. Know what you are carrying, know who benefits from your silence, and know that you are allowed to set down what was never meant to be yours alone. Being underestimated can feel like protection. It can keep expectations low and conflict minimal. but it also invites extraction. It trains people to take without noticing the cost. When you stop making yourself small to keep things smooth, discomfort will surface. That discomfort is not failure, it's feedback. And feedback, when listened to, creates change. I didn't win by becoming louder. I won by becoming clearer, by refusing to translate ambiguity into safety for others at my own expense, by choosing alignment over approval. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in parts of B's story, if you're the one everyone relies on but rarely acknowledges, I want to leave you with one question to sit with, not to answer immediately. What would happen if you stopped protecting a system that isn't protecting you back? I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever realized, quietly, almost too late, that your silence was being mistaken for consent?